The forum that we're attending this evening is part of Psychology Week, and it addresses a topic which I think you all recognise as important because you're all here. But one of the things that it allows us to do is to showcase a little psychology, particularly at the ANU, but out in the broader community, and to say just a little bit about psychology, and that is that as both a science and a profession, psychology contributes to the well-being of any community that we happen to be in. It looks at important topics and questions such as the one we're looking at this evening. It tries to inform debate on those topics and questions, and it tries to collect evidence in such a way that we can effectively address those important community topics and questions and do something about it. I'm not going to claim that we're going to come to any sort of enormously significant conclusions this evening, but I hope that it will be an event which will be, well, I know it will be an event which will be entertaining, but I also hope that it will be an event which will draw out some of the relevance of psychology to very major community issues. And so I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Ms. Genevieve Jacobs from ABC Radio, and Genevieve will introduce the panel.
Thank you, John. Hello, I'm Genevieve Jacobs from 666 ABC Canberra, and I'm really very delighted to be here once again for the ANU Psychology Week panel, this time with a slightly terrifying question: have we fallen out of love with women? To which I can only reply, good Lord, I hope not. It has been a tough year or two for women in many senses, though. There is still abundant evidence that despite lots of talking the talk, we don't necessarily walk the walk nearly as often as we might, and that's despite continually increasing workplace participation, ample legislation that enshrines equal rights, and social change, including things like paid parental leave, that acknowledges the different reality and career paths of women's lives. There are still, however, proportionally significantly fewer women at the senior ranks of both the public service and private enterprise. We're going to be tossing around a number of whys and why-fors this evening in an attempt to explain why this is so. We've got a very well-prepared panel. We begin on the end with Professor Hughes-Warrington, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic here at the ANU. She's the author of a number of books on history and how we understand it. Prior to her arrival here in Canberra, she was the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Learning and Teaching at Monash University. Next to her, Associate Professor Kristen Pammer from the ANU School of Psychology. Her primary interest is in brain mechanisms, with particular reference to dyslexia, and in understanding mind, brain and behaviour, and people in their own particular context. Next to her, Professor Jan Provis, Professor of Anatomy and Associate Dean in Medicine at the ANU Medical School. Her specialisation is the human eye, and in addition to writing a number of major texts and academic articles, she's also served on a number of scientific advisory bodies. Colonel Nicole Sadler is the Army's Director of Psychology. The Army People Plan has been among her major projects. It deals with understanding work-life balance, career flow and the importance of family. Professor Mike Smithson is from the ANU's Research School of Psychology too. His interests include risk and decision-making, social and community psychology, uncertainty and statistics. Dr. Mike Barry is an ANU clinical supervisor and a private practice psychologist whose practice focuses on the treatment of adults and young people. He has a particularly broad range of experience in working with the military, veterans and emergency services personnel. Now, I have been assured that each one of these people is a darn good talker. And indeed, I've experienced a few of them myself. But much of this panel is about you, the audience, this evening. Now, I'll try to get in questions from you as far as possible. We do have a microphone. Catherine's holding up the microphone here. Please do wait for the microphone before we get to your question. The evening's being recorded, and so it's important that your penetrating question can actually be heard. Please do make sure that your mobile phones are switched off. And when you ask those penetrating questions, let them be actual questions. You can direct them to a specific member of the panel or more broadly, and I, Tony Jones style, will send them to the person who is clearly least expecting it. But let's begin the panel now, and I'm going to rove non-Tony Jones style among you all. But as this progresses, please do put your hand up. Just let me know that you're asking a question and that you're willing to have the microphone passed to you, and we'll proceed from there. But Marnie, I'm going to go to you first. You've enjoyed a very significant degree of academic success, and you've also taken on a very high-profile role this year, a very administrative role at the ANU in recent years. Have you experienced the glass ceiling?
No, I haven't experienced the glass ceiling, but I certainly have had interesting moments in my career where I've turned up to an event and people have said, oh, who are you with? I've certainly had people say, you're very young to be doing this job. Occasionally people kiss your hand and you think, well, I wonder if you kiss the male colleague's hand at the same time you greet them. You do have interesting encounters with people. I think more often people assume an age profile for you, and that's more shocking than your gender. But there was one moment this year where somebody said, you're the first female Deputy Vice-Chancellor at ANU, and I went, oh yeah, I am too. I actually hadn't realised that, and it was a very big moment. The UN Ambassador for Women was here. It was a very exciting moment, and I thought that's actually really, really significant. And I tell you that I was a metre higher that day. I was really, really excited about that. And my job is to make sure that many, many more women actually get into very senior roles. We don't use the word administration, Genevieve, because that makes it sound really boring. This is leadership, and we need more women in leadership roles.
I see. But I wondered though, last weekend I read an article in The Australian about the CEO of a major US tech firm, and she said that essentially her strategy throughout her career had not been to disclose that she was in fact a woman. That she'd done everything she could think of not to draw attention to her womanhood. I wonder whether you've ever felt the need to be a man to succeed.
I've actually got an ambiguous first name, which a lot of people can't spell, which is fantastic. So some people have actually assumed that I'm a man, which is kind of, okay. I've never felt that I needed to be a man because there are always times where you make tough decisions. There are no men's decisions or women's decisions. What I've always felt is that women sometimes are a little underconfident in what they are. They sometimes think that somebody will notice how good they are and sit there quietly while they quietly overachieve. And I think it's sometimes we are, in fact, maybe we take ourselves for granted, and that's a really big issue for women.
Nicole Sadler, let me turn to you. The Army is often seen as blokiness personified. Tell me what it was like to take on a culture where the institution may work very well mandate equal opportunity, but the reality is that there's a deeply embedded hierarchy, and that men have always been at the top of that hierarchy.
Look, it has its challenges, but I also work within a profession which is predominantly women, and I think the fact that I bring a specialist, the input that you provide is specialist, so you're not necessarily seen as encroaching on their area. So I think that perhaps they're a little bit more forgiving in terms of listening to your advice or letting you progress through the ranks. But look, there's certainly challenges, but I don't think that sometimes the challenges that people imagine are there for women in the Army are necessarily as bad as you may imagine.
Although, as you said, that's perhaps because of the field in which you're working, and it's perhaps easier to be a Director of Psychology for the Army as a woman than it is to be Director of many other fields within the Army. Would you concede that yours has been an easier career path than a woman who was wanting to progress through engineering, for example, something like that?
I don't know if I'd say it's an easier career path. You're still required to meet the same obligations in terms of the courses that you do, or that you're competitive, or your profile is seen as competitive for being selected for jobs. Are there more opportunities? Perhaps.
Because that's the easy way for the Army to provide equal opportunity, to make sure that there are lots of women in places where it's safe to have women.
Yeah, look, I think that we're trying to increase the number of women who go into different areas, but part of the problem that we have is attracting women to come into the Army. In fact, when we get women into the Army, their propensity to leave is no different to males. It is convincing women in the first place that being in the Army is not a terrible place to be. And some of the stuff that we've found is that when you provide women with an opportunity, for example, to come in and just try it for a year, once they get in and they work out, that in fact it's not as blokey as they think that it might be, and that perhaps Army women are not as blokey as they thought that they may have been. and in fact the physical standards and how challenging or tough it is, perhaps the stories which are blown out of proportion, and actually it is an organisation which is fairly transparent in terms of how people are selected and pays equal pay and provides them with opportunities and interesting things to do, then they like to stay. So I think that part of our issue with not having many people at the top is that we don't have many women at the bottom either. So it's not necessarily that there aren't good opportunities for them, it is trying to attract enough people in to get them up that hierarchy.
Mike Barry, let me go to you. As a clinical psychologist, what sort of issues do women face when they're up against it in the workplace because of nothing other than their gender? We've had 2 women who said that hasn't really been the case for them, but we know that there really is still institutionalised and entrenched sexism, and I know certainly in my case in the media, probably working in the Australian broadcast media has brought me up against more sexism than I experienced at any other point in my career. It's a casual thing, it's an entrenched thing, it's an attitude of life. What happens to women when they face that?
They can face a real crisis of role identity. So they may have an idea in their mind of what their role is and how they want to fit into the workplace and how they want to balance that with their personal life. But other people may not have the same view. That can be a generational thing, it can be a cultural thing, it can be a gender-based thing. There was a report in the UK Independent about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it said that basically women from early adolescence learn that they are scrutinised far more than boys, in terms of their appearance, in terms of their behaviour, in terms of how they look. I mean, how many people here know what colour Tony Abbott's hair is?
There's less of
And yet, the media make a big deal about the Prime Minister's hair. So, women in the public eye are scrutinised in terms of their appearance, their behaviour, their dress, far more than men ever have been.
And hence the quiet overachieving that I think you commented a moment ago. What sort of stresses does that result in? What happens to people who are quietly overachieving because their perception is that they're being judged more harshly or more stringently?
Some women feel more pressure to work harder than they would otherwise need to in order to achieve. And like anybody who's working in a situation where they're perceiving inequity, then puts them under a lot of emotional pressure that impacts on their ability to do their job. They're focused on not just doing their job, they're focused on actually proving themselves as a person, which is totally unfair.
Jen, over to you. Have you experienced that level of stress? Your career has been longer running than some of those other women on the panel. Tell me what it was like for you when you began.
Thank you for pointing that out.
I'm a woman with grey hair, so there's no ageism here.
So my experience has been essentially that over my career I found it much harder to get recognition for what I'd done. That was partly because I think I had a different pattern of career progression than it is classic for a scientist. But then I had a different career progression pattern because I was female and married and had children, so that kind of fed in very clearly. I also found that in the institution that I was working with, which was not the ANU, very difficult to get recognition in the areas of achievement that were the areas that were most important to me. And so the university where I was working was very happy to recognise me as being an excellent teacher and very good at putting curricula for courses together. However, they were very slow to recognise that I also had very good research success. And in fact, until I came to the ANU, much of the research success that I had, I think, was attributed to the males that I collaborated with rather than to me. So I felt that there was a very real entrenched view of the role that women were playing in that university at that time. I don't think it was conscious, but I don't think that exonerates those people or those institutions at all that does is highlight how very, very difficult it is to deal with those things.
I think you've actually pointed out something very interesting, which is that often when we point to women's achievements, it's in areas in which women are allowed to achieve.
Yes, yes.
And is that a fair comment for other women on the panel?
I think that's a very fair comment. When you see women applying for a promotion or going for another level in their work, whether it's commercial or an academic setting, there are comments like that, and you often feel that women have been a little disadvantaged in getting the mentoring advice, which allows them to clearly highlight that it was their idea, they drove it. It's just because sometimes they're a little too polite in the way they say it, and it particularly affects women that co-publish or work with other people. There's a tendency to say, well, maybe she wasn't driving it. Yeah.
Mark Smithson, let me go to you. We've got representatives from Defence here. We've talked about academia. Those are both institutions which are really hierarchical in nature. How much of a challenge is it for women to succeed in places with quite rigidly defined orders of dominance, which is not necessarily a natural mindset for women?
I'd say it's pretty difficult in part because for so long we've had different sexual socialization that tends to make men sort of raised and socialized to be more comfortable in those sorts of rigidly hierarchical domains. Well, perhaps partly because they know that they're likely to rise to the top. But I think also, I mean, just to put a little bit of, inject a little bit of optimism in here, I think that's changing. There was a Harvard Business Review report earlier this year of a survey of 7,280 business leaders of various kinds, managers, CEOs, and so on. And admittedly, these are American respondents, so it's that context. Well, they were asked to rate men and women leaders whom they knew on a whole variety of criteria. And the women outscored the men consistently on virtually all of the criteria, not just the ones that you might expect women to score highly on, like nurturing cooperative relationships and things like that, but the supposedly stereotypically male ones, like driving for results, taking initiative, showing leadership and inspiring people and things like that.
And I think we'll talk shortly about this whole idea of how we shape and form our expectations of leadership and what that actually looks like. But Christian Pamela, I want to go to you, because you're on your way through, you're moving up the ladder. In speaking with older women who've perhaps been mentors or colleagues, how much change are you conscious of?
In academia, I think it is changing dramatically, as Michael said. Just looking at the literature, for example, and the experiences of older women in terms of, the sorts of things that Jane's talking about, for example. I have not personally experienced, but I have heard other women talk about these things. And I think there is a generational change. I think there is going to be a progression of, while at this point, there is an inequity in regards to the senior professor, the senior positions in the universities. I do think that is actually going to change as more women are going into the middle management and middle areas of academia. So I think there is a change happening.
Is it your perception, though, that there's any difference in those kinds of barriers that come when you have children, when family life comes into the equation? Is it all very well to advance because you're a woman, but not as a woman with children?
It's harder, and it will always be harder. In fact, a colleague told me an interesting story today when we were talking about these issues, a colleague of my own age who also has children, and she has a research position. And so about 8 years ago or so, and it was in regards to a discussion with a then senior member of staff at the university in regards to helping women with children. And what this senior member said is, we're doing a lot more about that, so we're going to give women more time off to spend with their children. The point being, of course, that's actually the complete antithesis of what any of these young women needed. What they needed was more support, because staying at home changing nappies wasn't actually going to forward their career, particularly as these were all research positions, not teaching positions.
And you then come to things like the publication gap, don't you? How you're displaying away the year, the 2 years, the 6 years that's in the middle of your career where you weren't publishing anything meaningful because you were at home breastfeeding someone at 3 a.m.
Yes, that's right. But I understand that there is more sympathy in regards to that. When we write grants, for example, that we are encouraged to put in when there has been gaps for caring, and I'm told that that's taken into account.
Mike Smithson, I want to bring you in here because I know that you have an aunt who was one of the very earliest computer scientists, and that's in a field that was until very recently overwhelmingly dominated by men. Did she fit in with the culture, or did she challenge it?
She kind of, well, she was an obvious outlier, both because she was a woman and also because she was older than all of the men in her class. When she was earning COBOL in 1961, and she became an insurance COBOL programmer at that time. So this is pretty much pre-second wave feminism. All the boys in her class called her mother, and she took that on, took it on the chin basically, and kind of worked with that. But yeah, she had decided she'd had kind of one dead-end job after another, and decided that she really liked logic and solving things and puzzles. And she'd heard about this newfangled thing called computer programming and decided to get into it.
In fact, I gave a speech not long ago to a Women in Information Technology conference, and it was really interesting to talk to a couple of older women in their 60s, who had been part of that very early wave of women in information technology. And what was notable was that they had short-circuited lots of the leadership paths by being very communal in their approach, and they'd remained very supportive and very collaborative, and they'd really banded together to challenge the expectations of the work that they were doing. And Jane Provis, perhaps to you on that, this idea of male models of leadership being the only way to approach things, I wonder how you've seen that change during your career, and how you think, whether you think that that's a way to short-circuit some of the problems we've been talking about.
Male models of leadership. Well, from my own experience, I've seen the best and the worst. And really, perhaps the best model that I've had was my honours supervisor, who made a sort of a naive young girl from the country realise that you could have a very interesting and rewarding life by pursuing academic goals. So I think male role models can be very important to male students and female students. For me personally, there's been a dearth of female role models. I've found throughout my career I've improvised, and I think now, though, that with more women achieving senior positions in universities, and I think ANU is now, but only has very recently become, one of those institutions where we've got a very good representation of women at the top, it's a major shift. And hopefully it will remove that sort of gap that has existed where, you really have to be absolutely determined and very creative in the way that you might bridge the gap and solve the problems that you come up against. Have you been conscious of the responsibility to be a mentor to other women? Yes. And how has that played out? How have you approached that? I've done a little bit of mentoring sort of through official channels, but mainly I carry out that role sort of in a person-to-person way with the people that I work with, students that I've supervised. I've supervised a lot of male and female students, and tried to understand the way that they were seeing their own careers, and if you discover then that they haven't actually got a model of how they might see their career unfolding, they're just kind of randomly behaving, try and encourage them to develop a model.
Because that's an interesting observation, isn't it, that women need to think about how to develop a model, where for men, in your particular field, the model simply exists.
That's right.
Yeah. I wonder if we can perhaps think a little bit about what happens to women when they do become powerful and successful. Marnie, I want to go to you on this question. I want to see how it unfolds. But are we less forgiving, do you think, of women who transgress our expectations when they do become powerful? And Don and I were talking today about male figures like Shane Warne and Bob Hawke, people like that, who we love and forgive for any number of indiscretions and transgressions. We look at someone like, say, Cheryl Kernow, who is judged very harshly indeed for very similar indiscretions or transgressions. What's the judgment like for women who punch through the glass ceiling and then have to admit that they've done something that's perhaps ill-judged?
Look, I think it is there, and sometimes the judgment, the transgression is about the most trivial things. So people talk about the fact that Julia Gillard can't cook. I mean, so what? Okay, she can't cook, but she's the Prime Minister, so you give her a bit of respect here. So you do find people being very harsh about things that you wouldn't ordinarily think of as quite significant at all, and so you feel for those people. You say, well, look, you know, it's completely human not to be perfect at everything. But I can't recall a time when anybody complained about Bob Hawke cooking or eating. Nobody ever raised that issue. They didn't talk about his hair. They didn't say that his top didn't fit properly. I mean, really ridiculous things that really are, I think, kind of displacements. We're so uncomfortable with that person in a way that we find whatever we can to be critical. And I think it's incumbent upon women to be very aware of that and just say, look, you know, I can't cook, but maybe you can't either. And just to be, when you're open with people about that and say, you know, maybe I can't cook, but you can't either, they often back down because they haven't even realised that they were doing that. So you have to really put it back to people in a very polite way.
Let me ask all of the panellists how you feel the Prime Minister has been treated. Has she been given a harder run than her male counterparts?
Absolutely.
Yes, Mike Spencer?
Very definitely.
Nicole, do you feel that?
Yes, I do think so.
Absolutely.
I'm going to disagree here. Tell me why you think that model of leadership has been so difficult for her to take on without being judged for things like the size of her ears, the colour of her hair, the contents of her vegetable basket. What is it about us that doesn't let us judge an obviously capable politician, whatever our political beliefs and attitudes? What is it that this is a woman who is clearly highly intelligent and highly capable. Why do we have to judge her on those things? Mike, let me go to you.
I think it's in the way that we socialise men and women. That boys are expected to be mischievous, risk-taking, more adventurous. And so when they are, they fit the stereotype. Girls are expected to be more sensible, more stable. And when they take risks, when they become adventurous, when they behave in ways that people sort of see as being stereotypically boys, then they get pilloried for it.
So that makes becoming the Prime Minister an adventurous thing to do. That seems a little broad to me somehow as a model for 50% of the population that leading the nation is adventurous, Jan.
Maybe the adventurous thing that she did was to be prepared to be part of the challenge that was mounted. And I was discussing this with a friend recently who made the observation, which I rather liked, so I'll share it, which was that in such a situation where a leader is challenged by a would-be leader, you know, it's a very male thing, and we accept this model where you have an alpha male and another alpha male comes along and challenges that other alpha male, and the whole thing sort of moves on. The new leader comes in and that's fine. But when you've got an alpha male leader and a woman comes along and challenges him, we've got no framework for dealing with that. And I think the sort of gut reaction for many people is it's pretty obvious that this is true in the community, has been that was a bad thing to do.
Yeah, and a bad thing to do in a way that would not necessarily have been judged so if it was a male leader.
And then you sort of follow that up, and then lo and behold, she's got Tony Abbott as leader of the opposition, who's kind of this archetypal alpha male type, and there you've got the basis for that polarisation, and that's what I believe anyway has been the basis of it.
I just wanted to come in on that. I think there is one domain in the culture here where it is okay for women to be on top, and that's crime.
Do tell.
Well, okay. Back in 2008, Bill Leak had his ABC program, Face Painting, and he chose 2 women to paint. One of them was an actress, June Salter, and the other one was Tilly Devine, queen of the underworld in the 30s and 40s. Tilly was listed as one of the 50 most influential Australians during World War II. Right? This was a brothel entrepreneur who was legendarily wealthy. So was Kate Leigh, by the way, who was a great rival at the time. It could be that, unfortunately, the only lovable women leader archetypes we've got come from that tradition, which would be an awful thing if it were true. But the fact that Bill Leak chose to paint her rather than another high-profile woman, I think is telling.
But perhaps he chose to paint her because she was a transgressive woman. Perhaps that's the influence. The women who are not meeting stereotypes are the ones that catch our attention, despite us feeling deeply, deeply uncomfortable about it. Madonna War complex. Christopher, psychology is all about understanding why it is so. What do you think is going on in our collective consciousness that women still aren't leaders, not just as Prime Ministers, but at any level that matches the proportion of the population that we represent?
I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of which Marnie's already discussed, and that is, I suspect there's a collective sense of, when women tend to go up for promotion, they have a tendency to want to tick all the boxes to the best of their ability in a way that men tend not to. When men have much more of a tendency to, let's give it a go, whereas women have to prove themselves far beyond what I think men feel they have to prove themselves. So there's already a self-imposed stymie progression, if you like. And then I think, again, this comes back to this generational change, that there's also an element in the, and it's difficult for me to judge this outside academia because I've not been outside academia, but from what I can see from reading, from just judging what's going on out there, there's still a generational problem. There's still an expectation of, well, first of all, if you're a woman and you are at that position, you're going to have to behave like a man. And that's the expectation of the men around you. And then you're in a difficult position, because if you do act like a man, then you're a hardened bitch. But if you don't act like a man, you're a big wuss and you shouldn't be there. So I think that's a really difficult position for women to be in. Once they do go to those positions, am I going to be myself in that position, or am I going to adopt a more masculine sort of leadership style? So I think there are both structural limitations, but I think we also impose limitations of the sort that Marnie was describing as well, a lot.
Nicole, do you think that women undercut themselves? Do women do this to themselves in judging that it's all going to be too hard and that they can't fit that male template of leadership?
I think that there's a certain amount of that, but there's also a lot of research which shows that women, they're better educated in Australia on average. They're ambitious when they start off with. But I think we also need to be upfront about the fact that there are some challenges for women. So some of them end up selecting out of going for, higher jobs because of the challenges of working out that perhaps having children and trying to negotiate the work-life balance is not going to work for them. Some of them get selected out because they have to take career breaks, or that's how they choose to, do that work-life balance balancing act. And if they've missed certain milestones that they've needed to, or they don't have the right career profile, then perhaps even though they would like to be able to progress, they just can't anymore. So there's elements there of those barriers being there, but certainly there is also that element of sometimes people not feeling as competitive. There's also that research which says that women will undersell themselves. They don't see themselves as being as competitive as others. If they don't meet every criteria on the selection criteria, they won't apply for the job, where a man is more likely to go, I'll give it a crack and I'll see how I go. And I think that sometimes they self-select themselves out subconsciously as well.
I'm going to throw questions over to the floor in a moment or two, so I've just got one more question to ask, but if you've got questions, just pop your hands up and we'll get the microphone to you. I think down here, Catherine. But my final question from me, from the panel, is how you feel and what you think the perceptions are about affirmative action programs, because this has been one of the ways that we've attempted to deal with these issues as a society. And I wonder whether you think that affirmative action programs are just incredibly important because they put the women there and women then prove they can do the jobs, or whether you think they foster a perception that the women who are appointed are only there because of their sex and you then have to doubly prove that you're really worth it. Mike Barry, let me go to you.
That's a tough one. I'd like to see the day where we don't need an affirmative action program. And I think that generationally things are changing. But when I first joined the Army back in a long time ago, women had their own training school. They didn't do the same training as me. Today, nobody blinks twice. So yeah, things are changing. I think in the future we won't need affirmative action.
Marnie Hughes-Warrington, what do you think about affirmative action?
I'd rather that we focused on the structural things that we just take for granted as being natural or habitual, and actually look at a lot of our processes and say, actually, a lot of people trip over it at that point. A lot of people trip over because even if you did have affirmative action, there'd still be trip points there. You just trip somebody up a little bit later somewhere else. So what you've got to do is actually go through the house, look at it and see, you know, women are not applying in the first place. Women are not going up for promotion. They're not doing this. They're not doing. Why is that happening? For a whole host of reasons.
Okay, look, we might throw questions over to the floor, and from you, yes.
Thank you all. Nicole, I just wanted to pick you up on a point there, and it's something that I have been trying to think about, and I wonder if any of you might like to talk about it, is the fact that you set up a work-life balance as if there's a binary there, they're in competition with each other. Why don't we just talk about a life balance in which work is part of that? And because I think when we talk about a work-life balance, invariably it's more about women achieving a work-life balance than not men. But if we talk about a life balance, everybody's trying to have a life balance that includes work. So how can we reframe the way that we think about work in our day-to-day lives that might help some of these issues?
Totally agree with your point, and I use the popular terminology where work is part of your life. They're not mutually exclusive, of course. I think that one of the, for example, for myself and for my peers who are also been successful women in the military, married with children only comes, the ability to achieve that has only occurred because my husband did something which was fairly non-traditional in that he stayed at home with our children when they were little. That was our work-life solution. That was how we got that balance. Now, that worked for our family and it worked for my husband. That wouldn't work for every family. And when I speak to women in the Defence Forces, I'm very careful about not setting myself up as the role model. I'm a role model, but I also know that some of the decisions that I chose to achieve that balance so that I could progress with my career would not be palatable for other families. They wouldn't be achievable. I've also, in the last 8 years, spent 4 years of that separated from my family where I've commuted. That's not the solution for every family. So I think that part of it is to say, it's about not having the solution for a woman, but it's about having a solution for families or for organisations and being far more broad-minded and flexible in how we look at managing those problems.
Kristen Hammer, I see you nodding. Your work-life balance?
Well, actually, it's the issue about role models, and I think that we can easily, as women, we can easily fall into the negative role models for other women. I've got daughters who look at me and say, I don't want your job, Mum, because I don't want to work that hard. And that brings me up because it makes me think, what is the message that I'm sending to my daughters, to my children, that to be successful, you have to work this hard? And that worries me, and I think it's something that we need to be conscious of as women as well, in that what is that we can be mentors and role models, but what is it that we're modelling sometimes? I think we need to be conscious of.
I think that's actually an extraordinarily pertinent question, and we're often told to work smarter, not harder, but I wonder how often we really do that. Next question up here.
Thank you. We've been using the glass ceiling as a metaphor for some years now. Is this metaphor still serving us, or are there aspects of it that are still serving us, or do we need a new one?
Jen, I'm not going to go to you on that.
Oh, gee, thanks. The data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows very, very clearly that there is something operating. It's clear from those statistics that more girls complete Year 12, more girls get bachelor's degrees, but still there are fewer women in the workforce. It's about 10% less in the workforce in total. But then if you go to and look at women taking senior leadership roles, and perhaps the best one is the one that was being spoken of most recently, is the number of women in leadership positions, CEO positions in ASX 200 companies. It's 97% males and 3% females. So obviously there's something going on there. The glass ceiling implies something structural. I guess that's what the metaphor conveys. That's what it speaks to me of, as something structural. And from the bit of reading that I've done, there's evidence that there are structural things there. Some of us were at a panel meeting yesterday run by Nanda, and there was a speaker there from physics from the University of New South Wales, and she showed structural things in the School of Physics at the University of New South Wales which were preventing women getting through to the top, even though superficially they had equity regulations. And then I was also interested to find this afternoon, looking at a document that a friend gave me to look at, a report from the EU, and the data were exactly the same. And they identified exactly the same things at the level of the EU that these analysts had reported for the School of Physics. And those things sort of came down to lack of clarity in policy, lack of transparency in policy, and perhaps also to do with the fact that where you do have a very heavy bias towards males at an organisational level, it's very difficult to change, because those males are making the rules by which the change will be mediated, and they're not fully informed because they haven't got enough female input. So what that says to me is that these structural things are still in place, but I think the good thing is that people are analysing these structural things. We're becoming more aware of what those structural characteristics are, and so we're in a better position to change those things.
Can I just share with you an awful anecdote from my early career as a broadcaster? I was standing in the green room at 702 in Sydney, watching ABC Radio in Sydney being presented, and a very senior ABC Radio manager said to me as a young journalist, "Oh, look, Genevieve, the fact is that people just don't like women's voices on the radio."
Brilliant.
And I came back and told my colleague Alex Sloman, you would have seen the steam coming out of the ears from a mile away. But I think it's an interesting point that you're making, Jane, is that people don't understand those things if they can't see the inherent flaws in the structure itself. And, you know, the reality in that situation is that people will not like women's voices on the radio when they never hear women's voices on the radio. If you never put them in that situation, they don't understand what the experience will be like for them. I think, was it you?
Being in a psychology panel, I'd be really interested if anyone would like to respond to the question about the mother-child bond being different
for men and women. Like, I mean, obviously the father-child bond is very different to the mother-child bond. And in terms of this work-family balance, you know, and there's a lot of stuff in the media about motherhood and being a good mother and being a bad mother. And what would you respond to that question about, from a psychology point of view, the maternal subject?
Thank you. Kristen, can I go on that?
First of all, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I'd much prefer to flick that one to Mike.
And you will after you've answered the questions.
I'm not going to comment on what constitutes a good mother. I guess it really is what comes down to. I think women who have children, keeping aside obvious breaches of trust and abuse and so on and so forth, all women try their best to be good mothers, and I don't think that whether or not you're a working mother or you're a stay-at-home mother makes any difference to the bond and to the closeness that you can have with your children. And that's just my personal opinion and the observations from my friends around me, some of whom are stay-at-home mothers and some who are working mothers.
Mike Barry, clinical psychologist, take up with that.
I think in very general terms, it's a very broad generalisation, men tend to define themselves more by their work experiences and their work role than their relationships. And generally speaking, women tend to define themselves more by their relationships. Now, that's a generalisation. But so a mother may define herself more by her role as a mother and then by her role in the workforce, whereas a man might define himself more by his role in the workforce than his role as a father. That's changing, and professional women, also very career focused, and a lot more men nowadays are much more involved in child rearing than back in my generation and before that. So things are changing, but I think some of it comes down to how we define and get our sense of identity from.
Mike Smithson?
I'm not a clinical psychologist. In fact, I'm not even a psychologist.
Why in anyhow?
Nevertheless, I think you've raised a really important question, and the reason I say this is because my developmental psychology colleagues, if we had one of them here, would be able to tell you that actually relatively little is known about the male parent-father-child bond. Developmental psychology has focused on mums and bubs. It really focuses almost exclusively on the interactions between mothers and children. And so when it comes to a lot of what goes on between fathers and kids, we just don't know.
Actually, that's really a fascinating observation, isn't it? And isn't that one of those structural things that we were talking about just a moment ago? Yes, Mike?
Just make another point. There's a video that we show the first years in the psychology department, and it shows the process of the socialisation of children at a really young age. What they've done, they've given a baby to a group of women and dressed in a white or yellow jumpsuit. If they say that the baby's name is John, generally speaking, the women will tend to bounce the baby on their knee and talk in a more normal tone. If they say it's Jane, they'll hold her close and talk in a more soothing tone. So right from very early on, mothers start to socialise the children to respond a certain way.
Intriguing. I think the question down here.
Over the weekend, I saw a couple of posts about the Prime Minister on Facebook that my friend had liked, or thanks friend. And I traced the post back to the page where they came from. There was a page called "You're Not Aussie If You Don't Like This Page." And one of the posts was a picture of the Prime Minister flat on the ground, actually fallen over in India, with the caption, "Belongs in the kitchen, not Parliament." I'm just wondering, should we be worried about stuff like that? What's the best way to respond to sentiments like that?
I think that's actually a really interesting question, because I will have to confess to you, I have 3 teenage sons and a teenage daughter. My teenage sons found Julia Gillard falling over funny in a way that made me quite angry. But I also stopped and thought, it could conceivably be quite entertaining in that sense, if you were entertained by that kind of thing, to see a bloke fall over as well. And so was I doing a kind of reverse judgment where I was being extraordinarily defensive about her simply because she's a woman. But I just wonder, Marnie, what would you respond to about how concerned we should be about poking fun at people falling flat in their face with heels?
When I'm not doing my day job, I'm an historian and I'm doing my research at the moment on the way people revise history, and that includes Holocaust deniers. And my answer to you is that you would probably just as likely find offensive and awful things about all kinds of people in the media, in social media. It comes down to how safe people feel in those forums. So, you know, without going into the details, there's a lot of times when people just find it great to humiliate other people regardless of who they are. So I wouldn't see that as necessarily being about her being a woman. I think people laughed when, you know, Malcolm Fraser left his trousers behind. They certainly laughed when Kevin Rudd had the lap dancing. You know, people do laugh at those things, and I think it's just laughing at misfortune, and that's what I wish to believe in that case.
I very much hope you're right. I think there's another question here.
I'd like to return to the father issue because just from my own experience and sort of observation, the women that seem to take on leadership roles often have a very strong relationship with their father, which I guess we've just recently seen with our Prime Minister. And also, if you believe the Iron Lady thing, and Thatcher with her father. Anyone got any insights on that?
Mike?
Which one? It's a really good point, and yeah, I'm not sure if I can really add anything to that, but certainly, yeah, what you say seems to make a lot of sense. But I wonder whether some of the other women on the panel who are successful women would fit that that image, I guess.
Well, I guess it takes us to an interesting place because we've been talking about what kind of female role model we are for our daughters. And perhaps we should also talk about what was modelled by fathers. Nicole, would you like to share?
My father was a Vietnam veteran, and I would say that we did have a very strong relationship. Interestingly, though, then relationships with your own children, you sometimes wonder about what sort of role model you're being for them. And my daughter was originally going to do psychology until she added up how many years it was going to take her. And she said, "Mum, there is no way I'm going to be a psychologist because how can I be a psychologist and a yummy mummy?" I thought, really? That's the legacy I'm giving?
Did you feel you failed at that point?
Oh, so many times a day I feel like I failed. But my children were raised by a psychologist and a social worker, so they was pretty much screwed from the day go. So I think those relationships are really important. But also, just to go back to another question as well, I think that we also have some societal biases around that. And interestingly, when my children were very young and my husband was looking after them, I had some very negative comments made to me about that and what a bad mother I was. And that was the terminology that they would use. You have been a bad mother. And I'd say, but their father is looking after them full time. They're not in care, they're with their father. But that was not seen as a good substitute. So again, there's layers of pressure that we put around women, and even though you might think that you've come up with a good solution and a good family solution, there is still some societal judgments which can occur.
I think that's very true, and I went to work full-time in Canberra when my youngest child was 10. And in the care of her father, at home with her grandmother living next door and an aunt and uncle living across the paddock.
Evil woman.
Yes. 15 years at home full time and a 10-year-old. But where do we have the next question here?
I just wanted to know the panel's view. A century ago, racism was blatant and it was acceptable, whereas now it's societally unacceptable. Sexism is still, though probably a lower degree, as common in society as it was several decades ago. Why do you think, whereas we've been able to shape society to make one completely unacceptable, the other is still a part of our daily lives?
Okay, who wants to tackle that, Marnie?
Two preliminary thoughts. The first is I've encountered, I hate to say it, quite a few people who said, well, didn't we do second wave feminism and didn't we do First Wave Femme, have we done that? And we sorted that all out, and you go, well, no, I don't think we did. So there's a bit of a feeling around that. I think the other thing is that it requires you actually to speak up every day. And it's those little things, and actually not to be nasty or rude about it, but to say, did you even realise that that's what you've done? And I think most of the time it's so habitual that people have just forgotten about it. So you have to say, it's not over, it's not done. And if I see that or I experience that, I will speak up in the way that we encourage people to speak up if racism is on the table. You wouldn't accept that. You shouldn't accept that if people, you know, behave in ways that are sexist.
Jane Primus, what do you think?
I agree with Marnie's analysis. I also think that we're dealing with ways of thinking about people and ways of behaving that are deeply entrenched, and they're not simple things to change. And there has been a shift, but I think the biggest shift is going to occur with generational change, and that's going to take a while, and it's not just when the baby boomers die off either. It's going to take longer than that, and perhaps we have to accept that, but at the same time behave in the sort of way that Marnie's suggesting. You know, you need to speak out. You need to point out to people when they're making assumptions that are based on gender stereotypes, no matter how deeply entrenched they are in the culture.
But things have changed.
Yeah,
I don't agree with with what you're saying that sexism is more acceptable than racism, for example. I don't think that is the case. I mean, my mother, for example, gave up work when she got married because you had to, and that was just my mother. That was just the previous generation. That is just such that sort of institutionalised sexism. It would be completely unheard of now. So things are changing. I don't directly experience the sort of institutionalised sexism that my mother did, for example. And even though there is still a language, as we were saying, that still does need to be addressed, it is much better than it was decades ago.
But we still have 97% of CEOs are males and 3% are females.
And even in academia,
that's right.
That's still the case.
So something is working against gender equity.
Actually, I think that the reason is, for me, is cultural, deeply rooted cultural thing. Because, for example, I'm from Korea. I thought Australia is better for women, but I found this is also very patriarchal culture here. For example, when you look at the TV town, same as in Korea, women present as very young, men is very old. Exactly. And then, she was an older woman. She got sad because she was not good with this young bloke. Never happened the other way. I think. I know a lot of women in ordinary workplace. They have a huge discrimination, sexism. I know all of you are succeeded, so you don't maybe feel less direct experience. But I have many girlfriends, had a lot of experience. It's telling me that this Australia still, it's not that improved that much as I could see as a woman.
I think very unfortunately, the fact is that the media is one of the most entrenched bastions of sexism there is. And it's just an awful thing to admit when you look at the role of women in broadcast journalism of any kind, of women in major roles. I think there are almost no women who are editors of major broadsheet newspapers, even in the ABC, which should be just a bastion of this kind of thing, of being fair and equitable. The percentage of women who are in major metropolitan radio stations and presenting in major roles is less than a third. It's about a quarter of those positions.
Why is that?
Look, I could not explain to you why it is. We here in Canberra, we've got 3 women presenters in a row. We are an absolute anomaly. We are the only ABC radio station in Australia that has 3 women in major daytime roles. Not that some of the listeners like that. I don't know, because I think we're judged. I think, as you're saying, that we're often in the media, you're being judged on terms of physical appearance. It's also the career progression, that if you are a woman in journalism and you interrupt that to have babies, then you go 3 steps back. There's a perception you could not possibly work full-time as a journalist and be having babies. You know, there are whole lots of institutional factors, and since media tells the story of who we are and it shapes the story about our culture, then that's actually quite a profound influence, I think. Mike?
There's something else I think that's driving actually both sexism and racism that is, particularly where sexism is concerned, is much more active now than it was a generation ago, and it's competition. Where racism and sexism thrive are where you have groups in competition with one another for resources. That's where you tend to find it really, really thriving, because it's a weapon, something that people can use to threaten each other or to outcompete each other. And I think one of the prices, unfortunately, that women have paid for coming into the workforce is that some of the men, quite a few of the men probably, find that threatening, and they're competing. They're one of the weapons they pick up and use is sexism and sexual harassment as well.
Yes, up here.
I'm going to throw the but it's got a loud voice. I'm going to throw the pigeon in here, because it seems to me we sort of move around the topic, and I really wonder, is the issue actually that as women become empowered and move away from their traditional roles as mothers, where they were all loved, but they become empowered and they become strong and they have assertive voices and they're actually out there being heard, like Germaine Greer, they're just not likeable. So, in other words, is what's really wrong is that people don't like women like that, whether you're male or female, that this isn't actually, this is not anything to do with sexism, that this is actually, we've not developed a culture that likes women in that role, so that women hit 40 and they're suddenly free of their responsibilities as mothers, and they have more power and they can be things, and all of a sudden they're seen as a battle axe or as or some other negative stereotype, and they're just not liked. And I think that for me is what is wrong in Australia, that concept that we cannot like women like that. That even our children might find us as empowered women not likeable, that our husbands might not find us likeable, that in fact we don't go back to being, you know, what we're expected to be as mothers and support persons, that will be, you know, kind of alone. So I'm wondering about that as our cultural legacy.
When I'm old, I will wear purple. But who would like to comment on that? I think that goes back to our earlier discussion about transgressive women who don't fit expected roles, at whatever age we reach that. Jan, would you like to?
Well, I think that is the deeply ingrained cultural gender inequity that we're talking about. That's what it is. It's sexism. You know, it's fed by our cultural stereotypes.
So that the misogyny thing was true.
Well, I think the misogyny thing echoed around the world for a very good reason. You know, we judged it here in a political context, and that was very interesting because that wasn't how they saw it in New York or in London or in many other places where that story was printed, and women rallied to that very instinctively. They weren't responding to whether Peter Slipper should or should not have been the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Hi. I was just wondering what can be done about some more implicit types of sexism. For example, if you were at Q&A or any of those sort of programs, you can see, you know, men dominate discussion both, you know, butting in when women are speaking. If they're even on top of each other, they'll have conversations among themselves, that sort of thing. Whereas women will try and keep, you know, behave polite, well, that sort of thing. And if they break out of that, they're, you know, shout down, but the men are not. So I was wondering, you know, what can be done?
Perhaps I might go to you, Mike Barry, about the whole idea, because this is about challenging the ways we communicate with each other, isn't it? This is about challenging accepted models of communication and deference. And I think you're probably referring to that. There was an incident on Q&A a few weeks ago when Kate Ellis was speaking, and Christopher Pine and Lindsay Tanner just spoke over the top of her, as if she wasn't there at all. It was the most extraordinary thing to witness. But it was Mike.
Maybe it's about teaching men to be more respectful and women to be more assertive. Yeah, from an early age, rather than reinforcing the stereotypes. Within the children.
But do you not think that that is something that can be quite inherent in women, that we want to make people feel pleased and comfortable and to respect one another, and so women tend often to hang back and let somebody else have their say, even if they're quite assertive and quite empowered. They don't wish to offend people by jumping over the top of them.
And part of the issue is that men and women are different. Obviously physically are very different in terms of strength, etc., but also think differently. Do we want men and women to think the same, or do we want to embrace the differences, the diversity, and the strengths that come from both men and women? If we end up with a homogenous group of people that all think the same, are we then going to regret the day that happens?
I want to ask two people. I want to ask Nicole what it's like to be in army and to get people to listen to you.
You used the term right at the beginning, walk the walk and talk the talk. I think that there is a certain level where, for the organisation that you're in or the setting that you're in, you need to be able to do a little bit of that to at least get a place at the table. But if you're really smart, you then fall back into the wider skills that you have and the leadership that a woman also brings and the skills that a woman might bring, which are beyond just the male ones. And if you look at very good male leaders, they don't use just the very masculine skills either. They also use the softer skills. So I think it's about trying to teach women that there is a time when you need to be direct and you need to be assertive. And yes, is someone likely going to say, gee, she's aggressive, not assertive, even if she really is only being assertive. But you have to be able to push through that, but then have the ability to demonstrate that there are different types of attributes that you can bring to the table. And certainly in my experience, what will then be reflected to you is, you know what, you have a different leadership style and we like what that brings to the work environment, or we like what that brings to the meeting. But it's about getting those things to the meeting in the first place. So you have to be a little bit assertive to get there.
Marnie, your thoughts on that?
Look, there are educational approaches to try and even it out. You just have to be conscious of doing that to make sure you get people contributing, particularly when they're from different cultural backgrounds. But also an important thing to remember is just because a woman doesn't speak doesn't make she doesn't make decisions. And as somebody who works in business, or any business knows, women make decisions, and if you ignore that, it is to your peril. So if you're sitting down with two people and one of them is doing all the talking and the other one's not talking and they walk out of the room, I bet you the silent one is contributing to the decision there. So you've got to figure out how to engage the silent one in that decision, because they're the one that often swings the yes or the no in that space. And a lot of retailers and commercial outfits are figuring out now that women who don't speak make a lot of decisions. And if you don't think about that, you don't get the business. Yeah.
We've got you.
Hello. So a couple of members of the panel have talked about how a lot of the expectations on women are self-imposed, and that they're most judgmental of their own abilities. If they don't tick all the boxes, they don't apply, etc. So I was wondering if it's really just a self-protection mechanism, because a lot more is expected of women. Like one of the most, I don't know, I think it was terribly rude but honest thing that I heard in an interview was a male interviewer who told me that at the end of the day, if we're to pick between a male and a female, the female has the uterus, and she's the one who's going to need time out for kids, etc. And we have to factor in those things. So it was, well, horrible to hear it, and it did happen in Australia, but I realized it was the truth. So I'm wondering whether, my real question is, how much of them, you know, when they know that they're not going to tick every box, and that one unticked box will be the reason cited for not getting the job. So is it really a matter of self-protection, really, when they don't apply for these jobs? So more of it being self-protection versus self-imposed, and is it because of a truly elevated expectation in a sense?
Christian, would you like to talk about that?
Thank you. So the question was, I'm trying to get a sense of exactly what the question was. So what, is it self-protection rather than self-imposed? Is that what you're saying?
It's self-imposed, but it's probably a self-protection mechanism, because we know that we have a sense that we may be disadvantaged if you're being compared to a male applicant with the exact same background. And usually the reason cited is you might need time out to have kids if you're young and fertile.
So you're saying that you might not apply in the first place because you're protecting yourself against being knocked back because you know you're going to have to take time off to have a baby, that those things are going to get in the way? Is that?
Yeah, so I'm sort of wondering whether these self-imposed, barriers against applying for things might be really because of a high expectation in the first place. So,
a high self-imposed expectation in the first place.
A high expectation
of others, from others. I think that's very possibly the case. There's two things that I'm thinking of while you were talking. The first one is the role, again, is this role of mentoring, is having other men and women, not just women, and I think that's an important point, that good mentors can be men as well as women. I think Jan mentioned that earlier. To say, yeah, that CV is really good, actually. Go for it. It's going to be fine, and I can't guarantee it, and you might get knocked back, but give it a go. It's okay. The other thing that I thought of while you were talking was the imposter syndrome that women fall prey to, which is I'm actually a complete idiot, and when they realise this, it's all going to fall apart. And I see women laughing here, okay? So, we all, and I say myself, yes, all other women have the imposter syndrome, but it's actually true for me because...
I'm going to get wrong in one of these.
Exactly. Yes. And that stops women from achieving. Is because sooner or later that sense of I better not try for that next position, because sooner or later they're going to realise that I'm not up for it, that I can't do it, that I am actually a complete idiot and I've just been fooling them all this time. That actually I think is probably also a very strong component of why women impose this upon themselves quite frequently.
I think we've got time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. I think we've got one there, one here, and one down here. Sorry, you were. Try to pitch you too, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm interested in how you measure gender equality, because we often talk about 3% of women get on boards, 97% of men on boards. We often talk about how many women in senior executive service in the public service. I'm curious about whether there might be other dimensions of measure, whether it's about true choice, whether it's about gender equity being true when there is as many incompetent women in senior roles as incompetent men. So I'm curious to know whether or not we set benchmarks that are derived by maybe our cultural dimensions rather than necessarily what's good for women.
Okay, I don't know who to put that question to. Jan, we haven't heard from you for a bit. And Michael, I'll go to you.
Okay, so I think the question about choice is one that's often put up as an explanation for why women might not strive excuse me, for the highest positions. But if that's the case, then I think we need to look very carefully at why. You've got to drill down a little bit. Why are they not choosing to do it? Are they not choosing to do it just because women arguably might be able to get life fulfilment in some other way? I was watching Modern Family the other night, and there's Cam in that was looking for projects to fill up his time, and he made a mermaid outfit for the cat. Right? So, is it a real choice, or is it or is it a behaviour that's kind of substituted, that substitutes for, you know, striving for that higher thing? And going back to your very initial point, is, you know, is there another way of measuring it than absolute percentages? Well, yes, there has to be, and I think it has to be measured in terms of males and females in the appropriate age group with the appropriate skill set who are competing for position, or who are moving into those sorts of positions in the workforce at a sort of a snapshot in time. That has to be factored in. So you have to look at how the population is behaving. But still you have to drill down and ask, why is the population behaving in that way? So I don't think it's enough to say that this is just about the choices people make. We need to understand why people make the choices that they make. And the reason we need to understand that is that, you know, it's the obvious thing. Women are half of the population. We've heard from the psychologist here at the end of the table a couple of times that, you know, women think differently, they analyse things differently, they look at problems from different points of view. And while you've got the 7% male and 3% females, you're missing out on a lot of that. You know, you're excluding that that source of information, that source of creativity, and it's going to slow down the way industries and those companies develop. And in the end, a lot of companies are recognising that this is going to affect their productivity in the longer term. So it sort of gets down to hard economics.
Mike, you want to comment?
Yeah, measuring these things is really difficult. It's easy to measure them really badly, and that's what often happens. I'll just give one example. If I'm sitting on a funding panel like the ARC, for example, the ARC funding panel, we get applications. One of the things that we make an attempt to do, not a terribly good attempt, but an attempt, is to judge the person's productivity, their research record, relative to the opportunity that they've had. Now that seems to me to be a fundamental first step. It's not the final step by any means in that kind of measurement, but it's one of the crucial ingredients. And for a long time, until fairly recently, that was just ignored. We just looked at things in terms of absolute levels of productivity or percentages and stuff like that. And another difficulty is choosing what to measure. One of the encouraging things about, as flawed as they are, the Human Development Index from the UN, DP, or the triple bottom line accounting efforts that some corporations are making and so on, is that at least some social elements are being moved in and counted along with the economic ones. And I think until we start doing things like that and start tying those up with issues around sustainability, that measuring gender equality or inequality is going to be a very flawed enterprise. I think including taking careful consideration of what it is we're measuring as well as how to measure it is really crucial.
Well, what about the happiness dimension? What about measuring the happiness of the person? The choices that they make.
Exactly. In fact, one of the elements that's being brought in sometimes to triple bottom line reporting, or for that matter to related indices, the Human Development Index, are quality of life indices that include things like happiness. And I think the more of that we bring in, the better picture we're going to get of the extent to which gender inequalities are persistent.
I think we've got time for probably, I know we've got 3 people who want to ask questions, so let's go through those quickly because it's been a long and very interesting night. Could I go to you? Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment about particularly what you said over there. It's true for young women too. I've found it as a young, strong woman that I have, I guess, faced difficulties. But I guess my question is about do you have advice for younger women who do want to pursue a career or do want to strive for the top and find that kind of key to the glass roof and without being labelled a feminist?
What's wrong with being labelled a feminist?
There's nothing wrong with being
No,
labelled
there
a
is nothing wrong with being labelled a feminist.
No, there's nothing wrong with being labelled a feminist, but I find that if you are labelled a feminist, sometimes you come up with extra opposition that I have found as a young woman as well, that maybe in the older generation it's not necessarily, but there's a very, very negative stereotype attached to the younger generation with feminism.
I think that is the greatest shame imaginable, that it is a wrong or a bad thing to be a feminist. But Marnie, can I turn that over to you? Advice for younger women.
Mine's very pragmatic. I actually have a coach, and she specialises in women executives, and I talk to her 4 or 5 times a year, and we go through all sorts of things, and like a doctor would go through a case, we talk through what's happened, what could happen, and I tell you what, it's sensational having another person walking through things with you and saying, you know, it wasn't for that reason, maybe that was what was going on, how about you think about it this way? I actually think that means that mentoring is really, really important as a solution. It may not be that you've got one to hand, and so in my case I've found one, and I think she's really, really important for me, recognising when I'm being underconfident, or you know, when I could have thought about it in different ways. She's been absolutely amazing.
I would also say that you need to surround yourself by people who are positive about you wanting to be successful. Women can be very unsupportive of each other. We can be very competitive with each other. You need to have people who are either male or female who support you, who will be honest with you and give you good advice, and give you good feedback, but also people who will support the decisions that you make. And it goes back to the stuff we talked about earlier, the decisions that you make to make yourself successful and to fit in all the different obligations you might have along the way. Okay.
My question is for you, Genevieve, and it is, if men have grabbed and dominated the internet, what future do women have? Why do I say that? This book is, How is the Internet Changing the Way You Think? There are 154 contributors, 16 are women.
I have no idea how to say the internet for men, apart from being active in that space. I do think it's very interesting that the internet spaces in which women are active tend to be communal issues around families, children. There are enormously strong networks of women in those fields. But I think that this is an issue where women have got to have the confidence to enter into domains where men are traditionally quite assertive and quite aggressive, and that goes to technology. It goes to journalism, it goes to many of the realms in which the internet is dominated by men who are very assertive about their place there. We have to challenge that. We just have to challenge the paradigm. We have to be in that space, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that. Yes, finally, to you.
I'm curious what the panel thinks about the idea that selling the myth that women can have it all might actually be harming the future generations.
Okay, that's a powerful one, because there are lots of women on this panel and in this room who have wrestled with that one. Can you have it all, and what is it all in the first place?
That's what my question was going to be back to. What do you mean by it all? I have friends for whom to have it all means to have their home and their children, and to be secure and comfortable in that world. For me, it's to have a successful career, a supportive partner, and terrific children, and a comfortable home. So it depends on what you mean by to have it all, and I think that's highly idiosyncratic.
Well, I'm just going from the background of Virginia Housing in its recent book, which explored the myth of having it all, and that's basically the kind of community concept of a really high-powered career, happy family, a loving husband, lots of money. And that is the idea of what women should be striving for, whether it's actually achievable for everyday women.
Look, I would, and I know Virginia quite well, and I think she's someone that I would call a friend. I would say that feminism didn't necessarily take the opportunity of having children away from anyone. I think that we should have a world in which it's possible to have children and have a career, but I agree with you that it becomes very difficult in certain spheres. And I'd be really interested to hear what other people think about that notion of whether we as women torture ourselves with trying to balance everything. Nicole, let me start with you.
Yeah, I believe so. And I think that it's something that you might change your mind on as you get older as well. And I think that sometimes we set up very strong expectations and goals for ourselves, and then as we get to different milestones or different challenges in our career, you need to decide what you're willing to do or what you're comfortable with and what you can live with, and you know how much your mother guilt is going to play into it, for example, and what you can tolerate in what decisions that you make. So starting off with thinking this is everything that I'm going to have and that's what's going to make me happy, you need to be able to have the flexibility to change those ideas along the way. I always like what the Governor-General says, which is women can have it all, they may just not have it all at once. So it's about being flexible in your approach as well.
It's wonderful to end with the Governor-General. That's a fantastic point. I want you to draw this all to a conclusion. Look, we've had a wonderful discussion. You've all participated very fully and enthusiastically. You have been a terrific audience. But let's thank our panel, Marnie Hughes-Warrington,